This is a bird's eye view of Old Testament history. I'm Dana Goodnow, and we have been studying the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, sometimes called the Law or the Torah or the Pentateuch. And then following those books established by Moses, we have what we have called the political books, that is, the books that describe the political outworkings of the nation of Israel in ancient times down through to its monarchy and the demise of its monarchy in the exile. And so it covers the books of Joshua right down through Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Today we're looking at two books together, side by side, the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And as we saw with 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles was originally one book. We find it divided in our English Bibles into two separate books. But as the titles imply, these books chronicle the history, a significant portion of Israel's history, particularly the Davidic monarchy, the reign of King David and his successors until the exile. And so in 1st Chronicles, we find the beginnings of that. We see actually the focus on David as king. 1st Chronicles, we would understand the author to most likely be a man named Ezra. We'll see him later in the book of Ezra, a great scribe and priest who had access in that post-exilic time to the records of Israel and most likely composed these two books, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, written then maybe around the year 450 BC at the end of the exile period. The theme of 1st Chronicles, we could say, is the Davidic monarchy or the reign of King David. That reign composes most of the book itself in 1st Chronicles. And so we could choose as a key verse for this book 1st Chronicles chapter 11, verse 3, which simply says, "When all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, he made a compact with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel, as the Lord had promised through Samuel." And so this is the overarching theme of the book of 1st Chronicles. You'll remember that our studies of 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, we saw a little bit fuller description of the lead up to David's reign through Samuel as the final of the judges and Saul as the first of the kings of Israel. But Chronicles is really interested exclusively in David and his line. Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, also focuses on the understanding of Israel as a nation under its religious system, under the priesthood. And so we'll find that the Chronicles give much more of a perspective, a priestly perspective on the monarchy period. And we'll see more emphasis on the worship that takes place within the temple precincts, an emphasis on the priesthood as well, and the way the kings related to that. So 1st Chronicles is focusing on David's monarchy. The book divides into two sections. The first section, the first 9 chapters, is actually a whole list of genealogies. Chapters 1 through 9 take us from the very beginning, from the sons of Adam down through the sons of Noah, the sons of Abraham, the sons of Israel, down to the inhabitants of Jerusalem in chapter 9. And sets us up for the idea of the king in the person of Saul and the sons of Saul. So those first 9 chapters read as genealogies do read, line by line, names and individuals, many of whom we don't know, but many we do through their role in biblical history. And when we come to chapter 10, we pick up then the reign of King David, which goes through the end of the book at chapter 29. And David's rise to the throne we find in chapter 10, and these events parallel what we saw in 2nd Samuel. And so we're familiar with these writings or these ideas that King David came to the throne as the successor to Saul. We find in chapter 10 a description of Saul's death. You'll remember he died in battle with the Philistines. And so Saul dies, and David then in chapter 11 is anointed king, as we read in that key verse. We remember that David's anointment as king took a series of years, a period of process before all the tribes came together before David. But Chronicles looks at that as a sort of completed event that took place rather quickly. And so there's a focus on just the authority of David and his reign, and he's anointed as king, as we read in chapter 11. And then we find in chapter 11, chapter 12, how David conquers the Jebusites to establish his capital in Jerusalem. And in chapter 11 and 12, we find a description of David's mighty men. So in a form of Chronicles, there's lists of people and individuals, significant people who played a significant role in David's kingdom. And so we have those lists. So after having read about the rise to the throne of David, we pick up the establishment of Jerusalem as the capital of David's empire. And David, in chapter 14, we read about his prosperity, that he is able to overcome his enemies, that he's able to defeat those who stood against him. For example, in chapter 14, verse 17, we read that David's fame spread throughout every land, and the Lord made all the nations fear him. So God blessed David and put a fear in the hearts of the nations around him, because David was such a significant leader and responsive to God's will. And God blessed him with great prosperity, military prosperity, as well as financial, material prosperity as well. We find that David then, having conquered the city of Jerusalem and taken that as his capital, moves the Ark of the Covenant, the visual presence of God, into Jerusalem, and expresses his desire to build a temple for God. So we find this moving of the Ark and the changes that are taking place in chapter 17 and other verses along the way. We'll remember from our earlier study that the first attempt to move the ark into Jerusalem ended in a disaster, the death of an individual who put his hand on the ark to steady it while it was on the ox cart. We find in this second movement of the ark into Jerusalem that they actually did it in a biblical and an appropriate way, and they recognized that they had done it inappropriately before. And so God honors them, and David is able to bring the ark into Jerusalem. David also expresses this great desire to build a temple for God. And God says, no, you won't be the one to build the temple, but I will allow your son to do that. But I'm going to instead give you a house of your own, a household or a dynasty that will last forever. And again, this Davidic covenant, this unconditional covenant that God established with David, demonstrates that God would bless the nation of Israel with a Davidic king, a descendant of David, who would sit on the throne forever. Chapter 17 of 1 Chronicles, verse 14 says, I will set him over my house and my kingdom forever. His throne will be established forever. Well, that would find its immediate fulfillment in David's son Solomon, but its ultimate fulfillment, of course, in the person of Jesus Christ, a descendant of David in the flesh, but being God in the flesh, Jesus Christ, who rules forever. So David establishes his capital at Jerusalem, and God blesses him with that great Davidic covenant. The rest of the book goes on and describes some of David's military successes along the way, defeating the nations around him, including the Philistines, who were a perpetual enemy. David was able to subdue them. And then we find in chapters 22 through 26, David's preparations for building this wonderful temple that would highlight the city of Jerusalem. And again, this book, the Chronicles, being written from a priestly perspective, the focus on the building of the temple takes a very high priority in the book. Several chapters devoted to that itself. It talks about in chapter 22, for example, David preparing the building materials, getting them all ready for Solomon to construct the temple. And then the preparation of the Levites, those who would serve in the temple, is a significant message in this book as well. Chapter 23, we read about this idea of preparing the Levites for their service. In verses 1 and following, it says, when David was old and full of years, he made his son Solomon king over Israel. He gathered together all the leaders of Israel, as well as the priests and the Levites. The Levites 30 years old or more were counted, and the total number was 38,000, and David's assigned to them to be gatekeepers and servants within the temple, and to serve effectively in the temple worship. And this was part of what David did, was to organize the worship. And so not only was he a great military leader, but spiritually speaking, religiously speaking, he helped to establish the patterns of worship that would take place for a long, long time in Israel. He also assigned various musicians to be servants. And you know that David, of course, was a musician himself and composed so many of the Psalms that we find in the Old Testament. And here in chapter 25, we can find in verses 6 through 7 that there is the appointment of musicians that David sets aside. He says, all these men were under the supervision of their fathers for the music of the temple of the Lord, with cymbals, lyres, and harps, for the ministry at the house of God. And it says all of them were trained and skilled in music for the Lord. And so there's an emphasis on worship that we find emphasized in Chronicles. And this is a stream of thinking that we didn't find so much in the earlier books of the histories of Israel, but we find here in Chronicles there is a great emphasis on worshiping God and doing it with music and song and ritual and all that goes with that. And then we find in the last chapters 27 through 29, that David then passes off the leadership to Solomon, and Solomon takes charge as king of Israel. In chapter 28, verse 9, David says, "And you, my son Solomon, acknowledge the God of your father and serve him with wholehearted devotion and with a willing mind, for the Lord searches every heart and understands every motive behind every thought. And if you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will reject you forever." Well, good words of warning to David's son Solomon. Be faithful to God. Good words of warning to us as well. And we find then that David passed away and Solomon took the throne. So this concludes First Chronicles. But again, First and Second Chronicles being a flowing book, one book in the original Hebrew, we find that we move right into Second Chronicles, where we read about King Solomon's reign. So again, the author of Second Chronicles likely is Ezra, about 450 BC. And the theme is that Davidic line of kings, those kings that would come from David's line. And so we have this succession of kings beginning with Solomon down through the end of the monarchy. A good key verse for us then is chapter 7, verse 14, where we read these words, "If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land." God's promise to his people Israel. If you turn to me, I will turn to you with favor. And so it's a promise to the people of Israel, and one that we can carry over to our own day, to know that God will bless us as we follow after his way. If we call on him, he will hear us and bless us. So the book of Second Chronicles also divides nicely into two major sections. First section deals with the reign of King Solomon, the first 9 chapters of the book. And then chapters 10 through 36 follow through the southern kingdom of Judah, all the kings that followed after Solomon. In the opening chapters, then, we read of King Solomon coming onto the throne of Israel as we see the handoff of the rule from David. Chapter 1, verse 1 says, "Solomon, son of David, established himself firmly over his kingdom, for the Lord his God was with him and made him exceedingly great." And so God was with Solomon. He blessed Solomon. We remember that, as we see here in chapter 1 again, that God offered Solomon a great gift. He said, "Ask for anything, and I'll give it to you." Solomon asked for wisdom. "Help me, God, to know how to govern these people. Help me to be a good leader." And God granted him extraordinary wisdom so that he was able to govern the people well. We find in chapters 2 through 7 then this temple, the construction of the temple that God had designed, that God had intended for Solomon to build rather than David. And Solomon constructs this temple. A great emphasis on the temple, again, because this is a book written from a priestly perspective. It emphasizes the temple, its furnishings, and all that go with it. In chapter 5, we read about the ark being brought into the temple of God. So the temple being completed, the Ark of the Covenant is taken from its temporary location and moved into the temple itself, where it would reside. And there we would see again the focus on the very presence of God among his people, and within the symbolism of the ark within the temple. And in that setting, we find, for example, in chapter 5, verse 7, that the priest then brought the ark of the Lord's covenant to its place in the inner sanctuary of the temple, the most holy place, and put it beneath the wings of the cherubim. And so we have here the ark of the covenant included in the temple. And we find in verses 13, 14 of that chapter, the trumpeters and singers joined in unison as with one voice to give praise and thanks to the Lord. Accompanied by trumpets, cymbals, and other instruments, they raised their voices in praise to the Lord and saying, "He is good, his love endures forever." What a great celebration The temple is completed. The Ark of the Covenant has been placed within the holy place of the most holy place of the temple, and God is present among his people. The temple is then dedicated in chapter 6, and Solomon pronounces a blessing on the people, shares a brief, if you will, message or challenge, a sermon, if you will, and then offers a prayer to God of dedication to the temple, asking God to be merciful to the people of Israel, to hear them when they call out to him, even in their times of rejection, when they call on God. Solomon asks God to hear them, and God agrees to do that. And so then in chapter 7, we find that God indeed fills the temple. And in chapter 7, verses 1 through 3, we have this description in which it says, when Solomon finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. The priests could not enter the temple of the Lord because the glory of the Lord filled it. And when all the Israelites saw the fire coming down and the glory of the Lord above the temple, they knelt on the pavement with their faces to the ground, and they worshiped and gave thanks to the Lord, saying, he is good, his love endures forever. A great phrase and a great reminder to us. God is good, and his love and his mercy endures forever. I hope that you've experienced that love and mercy of God through Jesus Christ. So the temple is dedicated. God fills the temple. The next couple of chapters, chapters 8 through 9, talk about Solomon's splendor, how the Queen of Sheba came to explore Solomon's wisdom and wealth, and how Solomon was able to show the great splendor of God's blessing on him. Well, when we finish the story of Solomon and Solomon's death, we find less emphasis on his failures at the end of his life, more emphasis on the positive. And this seems to be a pattern within 1st and 2nd Chronicles also, to focus especially on those successes of the good kings of Israel. We find that Solomon dies, and the southern kingdom of Judah now emerges after a brief time of separation, where Solomon's son Rehoboam, who is to be the successor, is approached by the nation of Israel, and they say to him, your father was wonderful, but he had heavy taxes, heavy expenses, heavy obligations. If you'll lighten the load, we'll continue to serve and follow you as his descendant. And Rehoboam responded after some time of counsel and reflection, saying, no, I'm going to make it even more difficult on you. And that caused a rift between the 10 northern tribes and the southern tribe of Judah, along with Benjamin connected with Judah. And so there was this division of the kingdom. And so the northern kingdom of Israel established itself as a separate entity from the southern kingdom of Judah. We found in the accounts in 1st, 2nd Kings that there was this back and forth play between the northern and southern kings that we read about in those books. In 2nd Chronicles, it's all about the southern kings. The northern kings are mentioned only as they're incidental or involved with the southern kings. And so we find in chapters 10 through 36 the description of this southern kingdom, the kings of Judah, chapters 11 through 36. And it's a running list of these kings, the 19 kings that followed after Solomon. We find that some of them were good kings, many of them were evil meaning that they just walked away from the commandments of God, did their own thing, established idolatry within the nation of Israel, all sorts of things. But along the way, a good king would rise up and reestablish the worship of God. And so we find this back and forth loyalty to God in this flow of ancient kings. Two of them we could point out that stand out. Hezekiah, who was a great king, one of the best kings that Israel had following after David. And we read about him in chapters 29 through 32. How he was able to re-establish the worship of Yahweh God, the true and living God. He was able to purge the nation of its idolatry and establish the proper worship of God. He was able to withstand the encroaching attacks of Sennacherib from Assyria, and God protected and blessed Hezekiah. We find his son Manasseh, who came right after him, to be, instead of like his father, one of the best kings, he turned out to be one of the worst kings Israel had, quickly reintroducing idolatry and false worship, even child sacrifice, it appears, into the nation of Israel. It's a reminder to us that our faith is not passed on from generation to generation, but that each of us has to make a decision for ourselves. who will follow and how will be faithful to God. Hezekiah, a great king, has Manasseh, a terrible son who reigns in a way that reintroduces idolatry. And so, but we do find in the account in 2 Chronicles that Manasseh has a turning moment in his later years of life while he's taken captive by the Babylonians. He is restored because he repents and comes back to God. So there's a turning point at the end of his life that points to the idea that there's still hope for those who have rejected God. Well, this list of kings ends with Zedekiah, one of the evil kings that becomes then one of those involved in the great Babylonian captivity. And in chapter 36 of the book of 2 Chronicles, we read about the Babylonian captivity. The nation of Babylon had risen to power. It came in and attacked Israel, or I should say Judah. And because Judah had rejected God, God removed his protection, and the Babylonians conquered the southern nation of Judah. They destroyed the temple and took into captivity many of the people, which brings us then into the period of the captivity or the exile that we find as the conclusion of the monarchy period. 2 Chronicles does end with a brief note about the rise of the Medo-Persians under Cyrus and the hope that instills, because that would mean that there's a new day, a new empire, a new dawn, where the Persian Empire is allowing the nation of Israel, the people of Judah, to return to their homeland. And so we find a tie between the end of 2 Chronicles and the beginning of Ezra, very similar verses that show us that God was not done with his people. God always keeps his promises. And so we find that spiritual drift is a normal trajectory for us. If we're not careful, we're going to drift away from God. We need to continue to be faithful to him, and that God is patient and righteous in his judgments, and that there's always hope for returning back to God. And when we have wandered from him, we have forgiveness in Jesus Christ, and he receives us, and he welcomes us, and he challenges us to grow and be faithful to him throughout our lives. And this is the message that we can pick up from 1 and 2 Chronicles.